Hello, I'm Neal Romanek, and welcome to the Feed Remote Production Roundtable for our summer issue of Feed Magazine. And we have with us some experts in the field of broadcast technology who are going to be engaging in we hope, lively and interesting conversation about live remote broadcast and where we are today. The past year, or we're coming up on a year and a half now, has seen a lot of productions really have to rethink how they do broadcast and have been turning to remote broadcast as a way of doing things in the pandemic. So we'd love to hear about what our guests think of the past year and also what the future is of live remote broadcast. So I'll introduce them. We have with us Claire Wilkie, who's the MD of Limitless Broadcast. Norbert Paquet, head of project management at Sony Professional Solutions Europe. Robert Erickson, who's strategic account manager of sports and venues at Grass Valley. And Tim Puschkeit of Riedel, who is, I'm sorry, Tim, what is it that you do at Riedel? Your actual official title?
I'm the senior project manager and was the technical director of the previous America's Cup.
Okay, great, lovely. All right, so just a kickoff question. We talk a lot about remote production and that's sort of thrown around, but can you just give me, we'll do a quick fire round. Can you just give me a quick idea of what you would define remote production as? When we talk about remote production, what is that field we're talking about? I mean, is it, everything has been done remotely in broadcast for years. I mean, the word broadcast itself means I can do something here and you can receive it way over there. But when we talk about remote production, what is it that we actually are talking about? Norbert, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. There is another term I usually employ for remote production, which is distributed production, because that gives a better idea of distributing resource. And then when we talk about resource, there are two main elements that usually compose a production process. Is technical resource that will either acquire, process, or distribute the contents. And then there are the people that will simply operate, manage for the technical infrastructure, etc. So remote production is the way that you will put the right resource at different places where they are needed. So that's a very simple definition of remote production from my side.
Does that sound clear? Does that sound like your experience?
Yeah, I would go with that. I think you were right on the head there. I think it's anything that is separating your MCI or gallery from the studio, doing it from different locations, and it's streamlined your workflow, and it's sustainable as well. But it is also, I think, using the term distributing is actually a really good way of describing it as to what it actually is.
Tim?
Yeah, I would agree to this, and I think also what they said before is I think we are going through a process at the moment, because in the early days we called it remote production, but in the end maybe you only use dedicated services remotely, and the most life critical features were done on site with the event. I think that has changed, especially through COVID, that you always progress more and more to do everything remotely. And I think that is a big push forward in these days, because at the beginning, maybe we called it remotely, but it was still a bit more the linear broadcast and on site with OB vans and everything. And that was our comfort zone. That was also the established business over the last couple of years. And I think COVID was more or less the icebreaker now to go new ways or to go down new paths and whatever, and leave your comfort zone and take the risk and do it in a different way or in a new way, because I think we all agree that technology is prepared for it and can do it. It was just the things of getting it done and getting it, and follow it up. Yeah.
Great, Robert.
Honestly, I'm last of four or three really smart people, so I can just stamp the whole ditto thing on this one. I think Norbert's description was entirely accurate. I would have used a slightly different wording on, for the actual production itself. But at that point, it's semantics. I don't want to take up any more time on it because I think they knocked it out of the park.
Nice. So what are the benefits? What are we really gaining when we're talking about this distributed production model? What is the the paradigm shift from what has happened previously to now? What are the kind of the key benefits? And obviously, when we talk about COVID, there are some essential things there, but just generally in terms of, COVID aside, or the need to stay at home aside, what are the real benefits that we get from this? Robert, do you want to start with that?
So if I were to assign an engineering term to humans, which is usually generally kind of rude, but in this case, it actually works really well. It comes down to efficiency and duty cycle. Especially in I can speak primarily for North America because that's obviously where I'm at and it's what I know best. Is when you have, let's look at like college football or college baseball, where you might have 60, 70, or 80 games a day. And, networks like ESPN and Disney and those guys, they want to be able to cover it pretty well. Traditionally, what they do is they fly a crew to every single production. You want to do a baseball game, you have a truck, you fly a crew. You want to do another baseball game, you have a truck, you fly a crew. So that means you're tying up a truck and people for a 2-hour production. And when that production's done, they go back to their hotel room, they expense a bunch of money of food and alcohol, and then they fly home. Which is how I've always done it, and which is what the technology allowed. But remote production largely comes down to efficiency, because what happens if I don't have to fly those crews to do one show? What if I can build a hub in Los Angeles, or I can build a hub in Charlotte, North Carolina, or build a hub in London? Sorry, I want to give the European people some love. And from that hub, I have a pretty large staff. And a TD and an A1 and a graphics operator and a producer and an assistant director and all those people can do one show. Show's done, take an hour or two break, walk into either that same studio or a different studio and do another show, rinse, repeat. So now that capital money, that CapEx that you had tied up in building those studios is now able to use a higher duty cycle. So instead of, a 5% or 10% usage, like what you usually see in trucks and such, now you can do back to back to back to back shows, and you can parallelize it. You can have multiple people doing multiple shows at multiple times. So now that capital asset you just invested millions of dollars on can go into a higher duty cycle, 60, 70, 80% usage cycle. So for the financial model is fantastic by going to REMI. Obviously, there's traditionally been some technical challenges. So I don't want to say that's the main one. That's just, to me, what I see is probably one of the main reasons for going to a REMI model. Obviously, COVID forced us to go into it, outside of pure economics. But the economic model is one of the primary reasons for doing it. And I like it because it's also a technical challenge. And I know we have quite a bit more time that we'll dive into that. But for me, that's where I see it.
So do Claire, what about you from that kind of production standpoint?
Yeah, I think, well, firstly, I'm not an engineer. I'm a girl with a vision. And I find remote production really, really exciting. Really exciting. I remember when I first started out in TV and I went into a huge scanner, one of the BBC scanners, and the engineer there just pressed the button on the side of the truck and it just started moving like boom, boom, boom. And my mind was blown. And I was like, this is amazing. So I love live, and I love challenging things, coming up with mad ideas, and remote production just opens so much freedom for that. And with, Elon Musk launching Starlink and all this stuff, we use an awful lot of Blackmagic design kit, which is great. It's scalable, it's modular for us. And we also don't have a legacy of big broadcast trucks. We're not one of those big kind of behemoth of companies. But I think in terms of production, you really are unlimited as to what you can do now with remote production, and tech is becoming smaller and smaller. And it means that for all sorts of sports, it's increasing visibility and leveling the playing field. And I think that is something that's needed and really exciting.
Great. Tim?
I think also remote production has big advantages, but also brings some new challenges. I think, yes, from a business point of view, it creates synergies, and it's more efficient, and it reduces the cost due to the fact that you don't need to send people around the world, or you have less setup time and pack up time because you only send the technology on site what you need on site, and the rest is done in a centralized production facility. then also in these days, it has, from a technical point of view, it offers you more flexibility, because if you have a remote production unit, you have built it, or you have set it up quite big, because you expect that it will grow, you expect that it will be multiple productions at the same time, as Robert said, maybe various games in parallel at the same time through one remote production unit. So it's quite challenging, and it's not the case in the early days where you, for example, were a bit limited due to the fact that you had a truck that is built for 6, 8, 12, or 16 cameras, or 2 or 3 slow-mo machines only. So this remote production gives you then more or less a bigger flexibility, because you can use the resources that are there and that are established for multiple production. I think it's also great, and sometimes even if I'm working in this business, sometimes I think it's sometimes still unreal that you move cameras, I don't know, from London, from Germany, whatever, that are located in Sydney, in Paris, or somewhere else over the world. It's just unreal, but that's our bread and butter, and that will be the future. But it's still, to be fair, I have to say, it's still cool, yeah, what we're doing there. And that's the same with comms, that you talk to people on the other side of the world, and nearly in real time, and in crystal clear quality, and that this is more or less then also the future, to keep it efficient, to keep production in the budget. That budget, what you save there, maybe offers you also the opportunity for new technology or for new feature, yeah. But I think also remote production gives you more challenges in case of you need more communication, yeah, because the operator of a camera is sitting in a different time zone, is talking a different language. It's not like the things you can do face to face. So you need to define standards, and that is also something what you need to keep in mind. So it means not that everything is easy. I think as soon as it is established a production, yes, you can make it really efficient, and you can save costs, because less of traveling, less of flights, less of accommodation expenses, and so on. It is also more flexible, because it gives you big benefits with staff resources. Yeah, for example, a technician doesn't need to go there 3 days before the event for setup, or 3 days after the event, flight time, and so on. It's like the person comes to the production unit, like a vision engineer, vision mixer, audio engineer, and so on. He does the show in his normal shift, and the day after he does a show from a different country. And so yeah, I think that is the question is then as always, it needs to be in a balance. So first, what do you want to achieve, yeah, product wise, and then also you have your restriction due to budget, technology, and whatever. I think that's also a guidance for all these things. But I have to say also it needs, and that's my experience, it needs also more attention to detail due to communication, expectations on the various sides. And then also, if you say you do it in a league and you want to do multiple games at the same time, it's also a question of quality management to make sure that everything looks the same and fulfills at least the same standard.
Great. Norbert?
Yeah, it's very interesting, and let me try to pick up on some of the core comments that were made just previously. Robert talked about business models, and this is where remote production is really important, is that it really helps to fit the business models by having the flexibility, I heard this word a lot, and the modularity. So that's why I as per the definition I given earlier on, when I think remote production, I think distributed production, because I really think modular. And that modularity is really where the business benefits comes from, is that you really put the resource where they have to be. I heard a lot of benefits in terms of logistics, flying people around before, during, after the events, the accommodations, the flights, and that participate to the sustainability that's also provided as a benefit of remote operating models. So really on that modularity, what is important to consider is where do you place the different building blocks of a production process? Acquisition, production, and processing of the contents, the distribution of the contents, and then all the different peoples that we are required to put the technologies together, to put a production together. To give you an example, a director, for example, might appreciate to work close from his home on a very long distance from the stadium on the sporting events. However, some prefer to get on the stadium because they want to see the atmosphere, they want to talk as per the communication element that Tim was mentioning, to talk to their cameramans face to face prior to the game. And there is that flexibility with remote production model. You can put the right people at the right place based on the production workflow you want to achieve, based on the budget that you have. We talk about probably about the constraints and some of the challenges associated to remote or distributed production models later on. But that's really that benefit of flexibility and modularity you get. Place the resource wherever they are required. That will then create a real ROI in terms of the business models you can derive out of this production model.
So it's interesting. So you're just talking about this kind of those different choices and stuff there, and it'd be interesting to hear, and maybe we can hear Claire, you talk about this first. But how do you think these new distributed production models are going to affect the way people work? And how might they create new ways of working, kind of maybe even things we haven't thought of yet? Because there is that tendency to go like, oh, we'll just do exactly what we've been doing, but we'll just do it kind of in a different technological way. But, you know, as we've seen with COVID, which just sort of forced us to think about how we work in a different way, that there may be these whole new sets of things about work itself that remote production may change. I mean, especially even like, I think Robert alluded to it, and several of you have that idea that how you use crews is going to be different. You know, you're not going to be flying a crew out somewhere. There's going to be somebody there who'll do something, and so even just how that changes how your human resources looks is going to be interesting. So do you maybe want to talk about that, Claire? Sort of start out like how might distributed production, remote production actually change the way we work and the way people interact with the production?
So I think this is a really interesting area. And I think in terms of not talking in technical terms, just looking at the way production companies have had to pivot during COVID and still make quality content. So for example, BBC Studios, the Garden Productions making documentary features or making a live entertainment show during lockdown, which is what Strictly Come Dancing had to do. And all of their talent was locked down across 7 different countries across the world. They couldn't fly them all back. They're all locked down in their communities. And so the producers are like, how do we film with them? How do we interview them? How do we do a pro dance routine in lockdown when we can't fly a crew out? And in some of these places, there was no local crew available. So through remote production, where you can send a kit out, a pre-arranged kit, it's very easy for a contributor to set up, and then you get a live video feed from the camera that we've sent out, which comes into our MCR here. So we have a team of engineers sat back here in the MCR upstairs, and from different countries all around the world, we're taking in live feeds, but they're coming from smartphones and then going into like Blackmagic ATEMs and Hyperdecks. And that was amazing because we were essentially doing 8 different shoots across different time zones and being able to deliver a really good looking shot and a really good looking product that then went on to BBC One Strictly Come Dancing as part of the live show. And we did over 140 shoots this way. And so it was a completely world first for Strictly as an entertainment show, and being able to do pro dance this way as well. It was all scripted. It completely changed how they had to work as a production team, and amazingly and luckily they're forward thinking and they were open to using technology in a tried and tested way, but open to using it in a completely different way that's not been used before. And I think we're just going to see more of that, because now they're like, well, that was easy. 5 minutes we were filming with a dancer in Johannesburg, and next we're in Slovenia with another celebrity within the space of 15 minutes. So it really has changed things. But absolutely, the technology has to work, obviously. There's a lot riding on it. But if it's tried and tested as a remote solution, it's the way forward.
And it's you're talking about like using smartphones or that kind of really compact equipment. There's that sense that
Exactly. So if we couldn't send a kit out, which was a pre-rigged camera and kit, so that is all set up here and spec'd, etc., and we send it out. So it's very easy for a contributor to set up on their own. So it's user-friendly. It's easy for them to work. It's something that they would probably use at home if they're a YouTube influencer. Then yeah, they're used to having a DSLR camera and lights around them. So if you've got that type of person, then it's easy for them to use. And but sometimes, yes, we were using their smartphone like this, and because there was no other way of reaching them, because obviously crews were locked down as well, so we had to completely rely on technology to work for us there.
So it's that, Norbert, maybe you can talk a bit about this, but this idea that you don't have to have like, well, we'd love to shoot something there, but we just don't have the gear out there. It's almost like, well, what do you have available? You know, what do you have there?
That's the thing, and this is back to flexibility that people were forced to have during lockdown on the one hand, but forced the mind to be creative in ways of thinking the production model. And as Claire, you mentioned, any device cannot be used to capture contents and can be sent anywhere to be processed and produced as a program to a certain audience. Of course, there will be different levels of quality requirements based if it's the World Cup final or the Champions League final, or if it's a day-to-day entertainment shows, etc. Because also the budget matters in terms of the power you can bring to these productions. But what's amazing is that all the pieces of technologies are here to put that together, depending on the scale that you're looking for, the budgets that you have, and from a smartphone up to a high-end studio camera, you can connect them and produce from their contents. And that's really amazing because as part of the building blocks I mentioned earlier, you can have, of course, a connectivity element across all of them, being the processing side or the operators for their panels, what they have to control, and you can place anyone anywhere. And if you bring the power of cloud, for example, around there, that's getting even more flexible. We had the example during the lockdown of an Italian company that has your cloud production service called Virtual Production, where they could basically cover hundreds of events with a very minimal set of crews to be sent on site, because as Claire was mentioning, they were sending cameras connected to a 4G network or a Wi-Fi network on site. Contents were getting to the cloud and having multiple different operators working from anywhere just with a standard computer. And then these contents were straight going into a distribution network, either YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, if it's esports and so on, straight into the cloud. And in that respect, you don't even need an infrastructure, because what the guys were needing, cameras or smartphones connected, computers, and a good Facebook or YouTube account to reach their audience. And that's really the amazing thing, where you can take from the one end of the spectrum very, very simple workflows, very simplified set of live productions, using the power of decentralized production, distributed production, using technologies such as mobile networks, cloud, and computer technologies. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you can have big production companies like NEP that will have production hubs coping with the largest entertainment or sporting events in a decentralized way, in a remote production environment, saving massive numbers of crews flying around. And still you need a massive number of crew because the editorial requires it, because you need replay operators, you need a proper technical director for the vision mixer, you need graphics, you need extra set of editorial contents. But that's the flexibility, and the scaling that is enabled for me is really wonderful, because you can really scale up and down. And Tim, just to finish off on my part, you were mentioning about Obi trucks being designed for a 16 camera operations. How much they really operate on a 16 camera scale on a day-to-day basis? Once, twice a week, whereas in reality, the other 5 days a week, either they're on the road or maybe they are producing 6 cameras show. So how much of that CapEx is underused? And that's also interesting in terms of this decentralized distributed model, is the better use of the resource, whether they are human or processing and technical. And that's really the amazing thing that I can take out of this example.
Robert, do you want to jump in there about, like, how do you think this is gonna start changing the how people do productions and how people do things?
I usually come onto these things with one rule: don't have my VP of marketing call me and say, you said this in public. Well, I'm going to teeter that line just for a second. Some good did come from COVID.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's crazy to say, but there's been technology in our industry for the past 5 or 10 years of doing remote productions more efficient and differently. But the way we've been doing production for eternity has worked. So a lot of the TV networks, a lot of the broadcasters were quite reticent to make the change. You know, you always have these engineers in the background. Hey, you know what? We could do it this way better if we try this workflow, or this technology will allow us to do it this much more efficient, or you know, something along those lines. You always have these engineers that want to improve, that want to do better. And then somebody in the network will be like, you know, I get that, but this is how we've done it. This is a premier event. We don't want to screw with our cash cow, so we're going to keep doing it the way we've always done it. I think all of us in this group has run into that. This is how I've done it. This is how we're going to continue to do it. COVID took the gloves off. COVID opened up the door to every engineer saying, hey, you know what? Let's try it this way. We've never done it before. The risk is actually pretty low, so let's try it. So I think it opened up this concept of innovation with engineers, which have always been there, but with the senior management, and it raised the tolerance for failure. And our industry's never been a fan of that. You know, true success, true moving forward, true innovation comes with the concept of I'm going to try something. It may fail. If it does fail, I'm going to learn from it and move forward. Esports has dominated that for the last 10 years, and broadcast has not. You know, I'm obviously going to plug a Grass Valley product somewhere around here. So we've had the Grass Valley AMP platform, which is doing the entire production in the cloud. It's video switchers in the cloud, audio mixers in the cloud, graphics platforms in the cloud, multi-viewing, everything all in AWS or Azure using microservices. Something we've had for years now. If you would have said 18 months ago that the Super Bowl would have been produced in a software microservices-based platform in the cloud, everybody would have said, no way. That just doesn't make sense, because the risk is higher. It's a very non-traditional workflow, and you have $1.5 million every 30 seconds on the line for it. But this year they did it. And that's the good that came from it. It's the opening of the eyes. It's pushing the technology. But the other important part is the technology has to be ready for it. A very good example. Grass Valley is a camera it's called the LDX100. And it's a native IP camera. There is no base station. There is nothing on it. It's 2110 uncompressed video. When COVID hit, we had this camera. And one thing about uncompressed video, you know, a 1080p signal for the non-engineers, that's 3 gigabits per second. It's a mental amount of bandwidth. UHD is 12 gigabits per second, which is even a more mental amount of bandwidth. How do you push that bandwidth around remotely? Is everybody going to have a 100 gig circuit at their facility? Oh, some people may. I'm lucky. I pay $70 a month and I have 1 gigabit up, 1 gigabit down. But that's still not enough to do one 1080p signal uncompressed. So having the right technology at the right time is important. So we have this camera that's a native IP camera. And our customers were like, hey, we want to use this in REMI, but we can't do this uncompressed. Within 3 months of our customers asking us, hey, we need this to be a compressed environment, we had a firmware update that allowed JPEG XS support natively out of the camera head. And so that's the other important part. When you buy your technology, you have to buy technology platforms that are agile. You know, if you look at like a legacy camera platform, you know, you buy a camera, and if you want to do compression, you have to buy another box that goes downstream from it. You know, some legacy camera manufacturers had to literally buy a compression company to do it. And then if you want to add things like HDR, you got to add another box and add another box. That's how we've always used to do it. So having platforms, whether it's, you know, cloud-based processing platforms, or even something as simple as a camera that's firmware updatable to be able to adapt to new workflows, I think is really key.
Great. Tim, do you want to talk about that, kind of how things might, you know, how things might change how we work, how this might change how we work, but also maybe talk a bit about how things did change over the past year and kind of what your experience was with COVID and how that, as kind of Robert was talking about, how that accelerated things.
I think through to COVID and whatever, a few events, especially, how can I say that, the smaller events, or where not the biggest revenue was in there, or like festivals and smaller shows and whatever, I think these medium-sized events had no other choice in the days of COVID than doing it remotely, because maybe the restrictions and less revenue due to the fact that no people were allowed to see the event and things like this gave them rather the opportunity, we need to cancel the event, or we need to stop it, or we have to do it remotely and really cost efficient. I think there was no other opportunity that COVID forced them more or less into this direction. And I think, as I said before already, and same like Robert said, is I think the technology is existing since 5 or 10 years. It's just about who is the first one who sends the guinea pig through the village, more or less. Who is the bravest? Yeah, who is brave enough to go through this challenge and experience, and who's also maybe solving and fixing the problems that are coming up with this. Yeah, it's not about failing, it's about learning out of mistakes and become better week by week. I think that was, as I said, getting out of the comfort zone, and you got forced to go down this new way and new route. And I think that was also then a wake-up call or a message to other broadcasters to say, hold on, if that can be done like this, then maybe why can we not copy this or implement this to events that are more or less the same on a weekly or monthly base, like a serious character. I think the big events like a Super Bowl or the Olympics or Football World Cup, whatever, where you have a production of 4 weeks, for example, with the Olympics at a place like Tokyo this year, I think these pinnacle events will still be on site, because you need the infrastructure on site anyway, and it makes no sense just to produce or to build up a remote production just for this event. Maybe you can share synergies that you use established remote production units already for this, but I think there will be still a lot of things happening on site and presence. But I think for other events that are coming back on a weekly, monthly, or annual period, with a more or less standardized setup, there of definitely I see this as the future.
So if I could just jump in just for a second, because Tim said something I want to jump in on, and I'm just thinking about it as we're all sitting here. And hey, Stephen. Tim, you brought up something I like about going downscale and being able to do events that we traditionally couldn't afford to do because you have to roll a truck and all this kind of stuff. And I almost think you get to the point, especially with remote production, where you can almost create a media factory. I think that's kind of the goal in terms of economics, where we want to be, where I could build, a common tool set or a common template, and then I can just start, sending out, the kits to go into that. So to the point, you get to, you don't build a new car from scratch differently every time you do it, which is how we've been doing it in broadcast. If you get to the point where you're able to kind of create a streamlined approach, you can start to support a lot of these smaller events. You can scale up. You can start, again, kind of creating a factory out of it. So I know my thoughts aren't exactly cohesive, but you really got my head kind of spinning on that, because I think that's, as an economic model, that's definitely where we need to go. And it's just really great to hear some other people collaborate that data points.
So I want to introduce Stephen Dargham here from Telstra Broadcast Services, and I apologize to you, Stephen, for you were trying to get into the room, and it was a problem with the way I had configured the hosting privileges, and so I couldn't see you knocking on the door, and then I finally worked that out, and you very patiently waited and are here. Also, Stephen, I want to add, is in Australia, so it is, what time is it there?
Roughly 12:44 a.m.
Okay, so you are a hero. That's what you are.
Yeah.
It's okay. Someone had to do it, and I can see familiar faces, Tim and the team. And apology for joining late, but better late than never.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, if you want, you can jump right in. What we've been discussing, and I'm kind of happy to throw this open to conversation as well, if anybody has any comments that they want to bring in too, but is how remote production or distributed production, as Norbert sort of reminded us, maybe is a better way of putting it, for live, how that is actually going to affect the way people work. So, we know how the technology, might affect things. We kind of see some of the business options, but it will affect, how I think about how I'm going to interact with my employer, how I'm going to distribute my crew, how I'm going to am I going to work from home from my living room, or am I going to work in a small base near where I live, or how am I going to choose to make those decisions about where to travel and when? So I have a sense that this has the potential to really alter how we think about how people do production. So I wondered kind of what your thoughts are about that, and also what based on some of your experience.
Well, look, from my experience and practical experience is before COVID, it's something broadcasters wanted to do, and they come in and we do workshops and put a trial and do real-time trial, and they go and discuss it, and it never get to the stage where it's now a necessity. So in my view is remote production and the way broadcaster will do future, in particular live event, it's a necessity now. It's going to stay with us. And I think it's going to change things for the positive. Let's take, for example, the upcoming Tokyo Olympics. It's going to happen, but it's going to be completely different from the way it was done 2 years ago, for example, Pyeongchang. Every single broadcaster that I'm involved with today for the upcoming Tokyo Olympics is the remote studio will be back at home. Nothing will be at the RBC, and they're going to do mostly every single broadcaster. They're changing the way they do things, the workflow. They're going to do international remote production. Keeping in mind, we would not be able to do that without the advancement in the underlying technology, the infrastructure, the telco infrastructure, and of course, the most important thing is it now is connectivity at a high speed becomes more cost-effective, reasonable, and that's why everyone will be doing it. So in my view, it's going to change how broadcast will do things. It's going to complement the original or the norm, as they say, the normal way that things get done. It's going to stay with us. And I'm sure, Tim, we had a recent experience along with Tim recently for the America's Cup. The America's Cup, we had 2 events cancelled in Europe, and luckily in New Zealand, being an island, it went ahead. But the network we put in a year ago, we had to slightly modify it and ended up doing America's Cup without a single person from Telstra proper on site. So we had to slightly adjust, and the way I say it is adapt and adopt. It's a necessity, and we have to live with it. So we adapted and adopted and utilized the technology, and we never looked backward.
So anybody else have, Tim, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, maybe because Stephen said that with the America's Cup. I mean, when we started this project, that was 3 years ago, and these days when we started, we didn't knew that something like COVID, the global pandemic, will happen and will
Sure.
Yeah, seriously. The whole setup was planned to do a World Series event with 6 or 7 different venues, as Stephen said, in Europe, in the States, and so on. And we even did recce's and on-site visits in Boston, in Portsmouth, in the UK, in Cagliari, in Italy, and so on. That was the idea, and that was the reason why we had a modular flyaway, OB or IBC. Yeah, it was also not planned when we started and joined this project 3 years ago to spend half a year in Auckland, New Zealand, for 6 months. But due to the fact that we had no events, no tests and whatsoever, so we did prototype engineering, and that was also quite challenging because we approached with 360 degrees approach, everything out of one hand. We did not only broadcast, we did the whole technology on the boats, the whole race management system, everything out of one hand, which was quite ambitious and created some synergies, and somebody had to go down this route and take all the challenges. And I think it was a big success. But also then due to COVID, we had an IBC on site for 6 months. And as Stephen said, we were there with a setup that was planned for complete different circumstances 3 years ago, with a lot of traveling, multiple setups, multiple backups, and so on. Of course, we had remote installed already, like remote engineering, data logging on the boats. That was, for example, coming from Wuppertal, from our remote operations center, or even the cloud was a remote solution. And we also had edit suites remotely in Europe that could do news feeds and so on overnight for the European market. That was all established. Then COVID came and the whole requirements changed due to the fact that not a single national broadcaster could send a crew over there due to the restrictions of COVID. New Zealand, as we all knew, luckily had no real COVID cases, no public cases, and because everybody had to go through a very strict visa process and very strict managed isolation. And then we had that flexible event because sailing unfortunately relies on weather. And then you have a shootout system or knockout system, so you don't even know which team or which nationality will end up in the Prada Cup final or in the Big America's Cup final. So you didn't even know, you couldn't even anticipate which broadcaster, like, is the BBC interested in the final if Ineos Team UK is not even joining? We don't know. Long story short, we planned a system, and at the end, I think with Stephen and with Telstra, everything bandwidth-wise we had redundant fiber and we had redundant units and we had a lot of redundancy and backup, even if it was an on-site production, and we used everything at the end. Everything we had no capacities left anymore due to the fact that so many local broadcasters asked for so many things, individual signals. Can we just get this with a different vox or voice over? Can we have this for unilateral services? Because they had no chance to send any technician or any crew over there or even getting equipment in New Zealand. So we were flat out due to slots, due to hardware, due to bandwidth. Yeah. And that is something we need to learn. And I think an infrastructure or a setup needs to be prepared for this for these bigger events in the future. And we were prepared for a different setup or for different recommendations, because originally when we started, all the local broadcasters like the Italian television were originally planned to come over and do their own little studio or presenter position and have their own links and things like this. But that did not happen, so that we really, and I had Stephen quite a lot on the phone from Auckland. He was sitting in Sydney, and we were talking about how can we fix this overnight, or what can we do? How can we bring this over to London or to somewhere else on the place to be live and to generate content, because that was also something. The attention to the America's Cup was not really predictable, because in these days with COVID there was no other big live event happening, and the interest in this event was massively, and that was like and even the requests for broadcasts and for feeds and even for news and whatsoever, and can we have individual interviews? It ended up that European broadcaster could call with a mobile number or remote operation center in Wuppertal that got streamed through Riedel networks and Telstra immediately to Auckland, to the belt pack, through the Bolero belt pack, to have an interview, for example, with Ben Ainsley or with Peter Burling and so on. And we just provided the 4 presenter positions on the 4 signals where we normally produce the various feeds. So the world feed was 20 minutes after the live show off. We suddenly produced interviews on this because we had everything completely at the edge. But this, as I said, required quite good cooperation and then a lot of communication as well.
Absolutely. And delay in here, you have to design the transmission with delay in factor, because if the delay is too much, it's not going to work. We knew from day one that's not going to be an issue. It's within the tolerance, within the limits, and the rest is history. And it was a huge success. There's 200 countries plus took the America's Cup, and as a matter of fact, I did enjoy it from live from our broadcast operations center, where we distribute to almost everyone.
So what about, we're talking kind of about these big events and kind of being able to have access to these big events and making sure they run perfectly, because they have to, because you don't get a second chance at the Olympics. What about kind of, I mean, Claire talked a little bit about this and doing some other productions, but sort of smaller scale productions or more agile productions, or even like, say, local sports or niche sports that may have like a big global audience, but are not going to, they're not going to get a whole bunch of money poured on them. I mean, what are the options for, and I think maybe esports as well, some of the sort of the tips and tricks that have kind of come out of that world, may be relevant here too. So maybe, Robert, you might even talk about some of that. But what about smaller companies, startups, niche interests, what are the options for them in remote production and kind of possibilities for them? Anybody want to jump in?
So one thing, and Tim talked about something that I love, and sorry, I keep feeding off what you're saying, Tim, so I'm just kind of rolling with this. Talked about the America's Cup, how it was wildly adopted because for a long time, it was the only sport that anybody could consume. That's what we could do. We had no involvement in this, so I literally have no skin in this game. But there is this ridiculous drinking game in North America called cornhole. I come from Texas, and it's literally, I'm sure you guys have seen it. They got this wood thing that sits on the ground, and people stand away from it, and they take sandbags, and they throw it at the table, right? Cornhole got ratings numbers during COVID in North America. The part I thought was really cool, though, and again, we had no involvement in this, is it was a complete automated production. Like it was AI literally choosing the camera shots. It was an audio guy sitting on an audio board, which that was a little harder to do to write the levels and stuff. But the fact that using remote production and using some really kind of cool new tools allowed them to take something as mental as cornhole and make money from it. And people watched it. That's the incredible part. Now, granted, they're watching it less now than they did a year ago because we have like football and soccer and things, but people are still watching it. But I think it's a really cool use of going down scale and trying new technologies. Now, granted, the AI every once in a while would go nuts. The guy would throw the sandbag and the camera would go off someplace and you're like, no. But it was just a really cool, fun part that I thought of where this industry is going to go. Esports has been doing this for years, about having small regional competitions that only affect a few hundred or a few thousand viewers, but at the same time can scale to 20 million viewers. So, esports has actually been kind of leading this a little bit, but I just love seeing stuff like cornhole and using new tools to produce that.
Well, where you can have this kind of like sort of MVP, sort of just you try something and it's like, is this going to work? Is this a dumb idea? Let's just sort of see if it goes. And rather than putting a whole big, huge investment in it, you can experiment.
Yeah.
Look, I agree with Robert. The remote production brought to T2 sports, it's not like you can do more for less. And with artificial intelligence and producing a small event with 1 or 2 camera that's controlled using artificial intelligence and remote production, you can actually put good quality show to air, and it's of high standard. The surprise CEO and CTO getting these days is, I need a large bandwidth, I need to pay more. Actually, it's the opposite is the correct, because they could do more, but it's not necessarily they pay more. They could do more for less, and that's where the difference will come in. Less people on side. It's not diminishing the quality and of the production for an event, and that's going to be a game changer, not just made for major event, but for smaller T2 events. It will be a big game changer for them, especially esport. You don't need people to manage cameras. With artificial intelligence, you can control camera. You can control a soccer match these days with artificial intelligence without anyone driving the cameras.
Claire, yeah, do you want to?
I think it's really interesting kind of talking about this in terms of outside of arenas or outside of parameters that we can control. So for example, long distance cycle racing, motorsport, ultra marathons, those sorts of things. And not just your big, top tier sports, but, for example, paracycling. So in 2019, before the pandemic hit, UCI, International Paracycling, came to Yorkshire, part of the Tour de Yorkshire with UCI. And for the first time ever, it was, thanks to remote production, was able to be streamed live and broadcast live using the 4G network across the UK. And so my team ran the remote production, rigged up the motorbikes, and covered 6 cycle races across simultaneously in one day before the rest of the UCI cycling coverage happened. And this was the first time in the UK that had happened on such a scale. And that is what really excites me and really drives me, is being able to offer visibility to sports that can't afford that level of coverage, can't afford that level of storytelling with so many zeros in the budget. And with paracycling, it comes down to humans and the amazing stories that we have just in our lived experience, and being able, and money shouldn't be a barrier to entry for that. So I think that's where remote production, using cloud-based systems, using 4G networks, and 5G is being rolled out now, is absolutely game-changing. And that's what excites me. And the same with, for example, during COVID, not looking at sports, looking at massive medical conferences, virtual live events, doing open heart surgery and linking up hospitals together and doing those links live. And that normally you would be flying thousands of top surgeons, consultants around the world, and using a lot of air miles and a lot of fuel to ferry them around. But actually using remote production and linking up studios to a central studio in London, and being able to field, going to these live operations, the patient is actually on the table and the consultants are able to talk through other surgeons in real time, is insanely amazing. And that's the way we're going to do it now. We're not going to be flying people around so much. And I'm a big advocate of sustainability as well. And if we can do anything to look after our planet, and my young sister is the same. My young sister is 18, and she's all for doing anything she can to make sure that we still have a world in 50 years' time.
Well, that's actually
absolutely
another issue that, Feed is, always trying to slip sustainability in there whenever we can. Is there going to be a point where, I kind of, in some ways, hope that there's a point where people sort of say, nope, so you can't fly. We're not flying. Sorry, nobody's flying. And how is that going to affect things? And are we going to run into another situation where maybe not in every country, but some countries where it's no, you can't fly. You really have to figure out something completely different. And is there going to be another step up at some point?
My wife is a flight attendant, so please fly. Just everybody, anything we're going to say here, don't do it. Fly a lot.
Just to let you know, in Australia, we've been privileged without COVID, but it's business travel within Australia is now back to almost normal, 2/3 of pre-COVID. I'm afraid although I fully, with sustainability and greenhouse emission, etc., anything we could do to reduce that, it's a bonus for us. Probably once everyone gets vaccinated and started to ease, I'm afraid probably we're going to get to the habit back again and increase travel. They say we've been locked up for too long. Probably it's going to be a jump increase in travel. But I think what's going to remain for us, and that's for sure, is the international remote production now with remove these technical barriers, and I'm not afraid it's not going to work. People now start to plan to do things differently, and I'm sure there will be positive impact and reduction in travel. They're not going to send too many people. Seriously, they will think about studio on site because it costs less from creating a studio, for example, at RBC. The amount of money they pay for studio space, it just, you can produce two-tier sport, 3 of them just for the cost of a studio. Take NBC, for example. They have half of the RBC. It costs too much money. Mm-hmm. You can do this without all this cost, and you have a better show.
And then when the Winter Olympics comes around, or the next Olympics, they might just look at those numbers and go, what are we doing?
Exactly.
Really interesting is getting back to where we started earlier on, is that sense of flexibility and modularity, where you place and use the resource where they have to be, is directly impacting the sustainability and the overall business models. Whether you're looking for tier 3 or tier 2 type of production, you have the technical access to it. You can plan with the right technology, and you will place the resource where they have to be in the cost-effective manner. And same for even higher end production, or in general. Just the fact that you use the resource that you need, you don't over provision. and you just provision what you need, and this capability to scale up and scale down, that's where computing in general technologies, whether it's cloud, on-premise, whether it's a set of modular resources that you share and distribute, all of this is in a contribution to better economics in terms of business model, as we talked earlier on, and then sustainability. Very simple. The more and the better you use your resource, the more sustainable you are. If you don't need to fly hundreds of tons of kits, and just this carbon footprint is enormous, but then all the associate people to rig it up, to set it up, to tear it down, to operate it, and so on and so forth, the equation on its own is pretty much simple. Now, what needs to be considered, having said that, is how you plan and put the right things together based on the outcome and the stakes that are involved. As you say, when you have 15 seconds of Super Bowl, how many millions of dollars are in stake? I had that power one day when I was in the Olympics in Beijing. I was at the switch of a button, the capacity to switch off 1 billion people. you think twice about it, but again, that's something that has a high stake. So you put the right set of redundancies, you put the right set of failover plans, you put the most expensive technology, the best engineers, of course, but it's all about the stakes that you have. If you have a frozen picture on something that is around 5,000 people audience, yeah, maybe that's not so bad. If you have 5 seconds of frozen picture on the Champions League final or Super Bowl final, I can tell you, you're going to get a few sponsors knocking at your door immediately with their lawyers and insurance saying damages. So it's all about putting the right resource, but all the technologies we have, 4G, 5G coming around, IP-based technology, compression technologies, Robert mentioned JPEG access, but there are many others very efficient compression technologies that enable to go to the lower tiers as well. The transmission protocols that can cope with jitters over internet, like SRT protocol. So all these tool sets, if you plan them and put them together with a common planning and language and approach, then you can make any production right from tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, whatever, up to the tier 1 production. And that's the flexibility that technology provides now. And I think COVID has, not good to say that, but has been this eye-opener that it's possible. And I think what people were not ready to do is changing themselves, changing the way they work for the last 10, 15, 20 years. We had no choice, no flights, no travel, limited people on site. So we had to do it, and it's possible. So many things will continue to implement and change in the coming months and years, just by the fact we know now it's possible.
Well, what about talking about sort of reliability and where things are? How is cloud doing in terms of remote production? And how, I know there are some remote production tools being used now, and Grass Valley's working on the AMP project. What about cloud, and how can cloud integrate into remote production? Is it just kind of another network, or is there some special things that cloud can do?
So
Robert, do you want to go?
I personally like to think of cloud as a compute resource. Mm-hmm. Some people have considered it as a holistic solution, or everything's going to go to the cloud. I understand that. Mm-hmm. To me, cloud is a functional set of compute. Whether you're using CPU or GPU or FPGA or whatever the solution requires, that's what it gives you. The important part about cloud is, and we've been doing this in broadcast forever, you have to design it to fail. If you go back to the old days of routers, you did an SDI router, you had redundant crosspoint cards, redundant control cards, that kind of stuff, because we designed the routers to fail. You look at any broadcast network that's IP nowadays, your 2110 or your 2110 networks, almost everybody does 2022-7 redundancy. So we're used to designing things to fail, and cloud is no different. If you treat cloud as a functional resource, and you design your system and your architecture to fail, and you have to expect it to fail. That's the part I can't say enough. It's not a problem. I'm trying to keep anything from being a Grass Valley ad, but our Grass Valley AMP platform was designed on microservices that's based on Kubernetes. Every cloud provider supports that. So if you want to be able to have a primary compute resource on AWS, and you want to have that exact same workflow duplicated on Azure, you can, because again, we're just using industry standard stuff. So, and we have seen cloud fail. I mean, the AWS and Azure and Google Cloud fails all the time. You know, usually it affects people's email or it affects their cell phones, but it can also very much obviously affect your broadcast if the cloud does fail. You know, for all we know, you know, we use a data center quite a bit for AWS that's in Oregon. You can have a squirrel cut through the fiber lines, or, you know, obviously they have multiple fiber coming into the facility. I'm being sort of over the top on this one to make the point. You have to plan for squirrels to eat your fiber. You have to plan to be able to go to multiple data centers. You know, putting all your eggs in that one compute basket is a mistake. So that's the biggest thing I can say is, you know, when you see vendors that are just taking a virtual machine and lifting it from a computer and installing it into the cloud, that's kind of dangerous because that makes that failover scenario harder. So look at solutions that are microservices based. They use open protocols and open stacks like, you know, Kubernetes and things like that for orchestration. It's absolutely key. The last part, and I know I'm pontificating on this a little bit, is it doesn't always have to go to the cloud. You know, if you use a properly orchestrated production system, you know, again, based off of microservices and such, if you are a company like Telstra, and Stephen, I'm not speaking for you, so please correct me on this, but if you have a ton of compute of yourselves, there's no reason why you just can't put it in your own data center. You know, AWS and Azure gets really expensive once you start doing video. Video is hard and video is expensive and requires an absolutely ridiculous amount of CPU and GPU. So some of our customers are saying, you know what, it's actually better to partner with somebody who has their own data center or just create their own to run it. And that's the kind of options, and this goes back to that kind of economic model, of course, that everybody's looking at. You know, do I want to spin up something for a small, quick production like high school football and spin it down? Well, then use AWS. If you're going to be doing an 80 or 90 or 100% duty cycle production in software, it may be much more economical to just have your own data center. So again, these are all discussions that depends on workflows and customer requirements and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, look, from my perspective, I see cloud is slowly, to be honest, taking over satellite as a backup medium. Nowadays, tier one sort of broadcaster, they want a premium, you know, high quality, dedicated fiber solution, layer 2 type infrastructure. But instead of satellite, but as a backup, they wanted as well internet streaming using the cloud as alternate. I'm seeing a lot of demand for it. The reason for that, it's much more flexible, and even in their workflow as well, because of the flexibility that cloud offer to those customers. It's part of their corporate network. It's much easier now to distribute and those live events using the cloud as well, in addition to the tier one high availability type, premium type network. So I see the cloud playing a crucial part in the future, in particular with those technology I mentioned, Zixi, SRT, ARQ, all combination of those. It will be possibly even the only network for some of the T1 live event sports.
Yeah, cloud can be made redundant by proper design and implementation. It's just, Stephen, you've been repeating a lot about planning. Planning is fundamental to anything that we do anyway. When you plan a system or a production scenario, you plan, you design your architecture, and then you execute it. So redundancy in cloud is as similar as anything that we do in terms of designing a system anyway. So you can have redundancy over multiple different instances over a certain service provider and so on and so forth. But what's interesting is the distributed nature of cloud provides by its own a certain set of redundancy. We are implementing at the moment for Reuters, which you all know is a global news agency, a cloud native news and production system for their entire set of agencies across the world. And by the fact this is distributed and there are redundancies in terms of the way the contents are duplicated, stored, and managed, there is redundancy by nature. But that's been before deploying that and saying how it happens. There's been a lot of conversations on their functional requirements, the backup requirements, which contents are important to be accessed in which timing. And in that respect, we've helped designing and implementing the right solution. So that's also the role of the manufacturers and the system integrators to sit down and really look at these requirements, because everything is at the expense of another parameter. If you want the highest redundancy as possible with the highest quality, that has an expense on the cost. And then this is where you have to play with a lot of faders, if I take the audio world, that each fader you move will play on the others because it will have an impact. You want lower bandwidth, you apply higher compression, but then you get higher latency. Just same goes with redundancy. The higher redundancy you want, if you want two private dark fiber network with different paths and ask that to a telco, for sure it will provide you, but the cost of it will be tremendous. So there are other ways of thinking protection and redundancy of the contents just by the way you encode. You mentioned, Stephen, ZXI, SRT protocol, ARP. There are a lot of quality of service protocols on their own, which, yeah, they use probably the same path, but they can use different techniques to protect and provide forward error correction, for example. I did that in radio communications. Redundancy in radio communication exists for decades, but just in different ways. So there are multiple set of techniques, cloud being one of them. But back to this distributed model, with all these pieces of technologies and components, you can really put them together and deploy them according to your needs. And cloud is just one subset of the components that you have at your disposal tomorrow to build your workflows and your system. So the processing block in remote production can be somewhere in the cloud where you as operators working in a stadium and cameramen in a stadium, the same way you could have operators at home with a production system physically on a private data center into a broadcast station. It doesn't really matter. And that's the beauty of this distributed set of models, is that all these technologies will be tool sets coming together for productions to be efficient and cost effective.
Yeah, so it is, when we say distributed, we're not just talking about like physically, geographically distributed. It's the distribution of resources, distribution of technologies, distribution of methods potentially that can kind of all link in a unified whole. We're going to be winding up here shortly. But I guess I just wanted to ask, where do you think we're going to be if you could like sort of give a snapshot, if you could look into your crystal balls, which we all have one. Say 5 years from now, assuming things are going to kick in now with distributed production, 5 years from now, where do you think we'll be with remote production, and what is it going to look like in terms of, it won't even be remote production, it'll just be the way we do things. How do you think live production will look in 5 years? Tim, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I can do. I think remote production, as we said, maybe forced due to COVID and the pandemic, has a bigger awareness. It needs to be in consideration for future productions. I think remote production is not always the key of success and the answer to all of our questions. It stands and falls at the end of the day with restrictions in case of budgets, of technical limitations, and at the end of the day also to things, what does the customer or the broadcaster tries to achieve with it? What do they want to do? Because it's also a storytelling thing, and as Claire said at the beginning, from an engineering point of view, you would say a live link to South Africa or a different country to show an actor during a show, during a broadcast show. From an engineering point of view, with a mobile phone, you would say that that's not broadcast standard. But if it does the job, and if it is storytelling-wise a success, and I think social media has learned us this, then it does the job. So, and I think the same then with the big events where Stephen said, Olympics, you would like to have a studio on site because you want to be close to your athletes and whatever. And it's all about emotions, yeah? And I think we play with emotions, and you can't really reconstruct emotions or transmit emotions from remote, because you're sitting maybe somewhere in a unit that looks the same every day. Rather, it makes no difference if you produce a big studio show or if you produce, I don't know, the Olympic Games, where a person once in his life has the chance to win Olympic gold medal with pure emotions because this person is a natural star or whatever, and this person has worked their whole life just for this moment. Yeah, that is something you need to be on site with this, because at the end of the day, we are dealing with emotions and we are dealing with people. So there the key question is, what is the target? What do we try to achieve? And I think our challenge is, rather as Riedel, as Blackmagic, as Sony, as Grass Valley or Telstra, is to provide solutions that are flexible, that are modular for low budget solution, mid budget solution, and high budget solution. Because you will always have the different restrictions or different interests that you would like to have a perfect and high quality technical production. Yeah. Where you say that is the minimum standard how we produce it, but also you will have then productions where you say budget and would like to have this as well, where it is maybe more authentic and realistic if it is jittering, if it's freezing or whatsoever. So, and I think the challenge to all of us is that remote production will be an opportunity. I think we will also go back to a bit more traveling after COVID, and we will go it will be a mixture balance. We will go a bit more traveling than now because of the restrictions. And I think the discussion is then to set your priorities and to decide what is the best for the next project, for the next product, and then use your various and multiple opportunities to get the best result.
Robert, do you want to crystal ball?
I think the biggest difference between now and 5 years in remote production is we're just going to call it production. I think that the technologies we've developed today for what we could consider remote production are going to be so innately baked into everything we do that it's just becomes production. It's just a tool set that we have to create the content we need to do. On the engineering side, engineers have a very unique challenge. Our job is to allow the creative people, the technical directors, the producer, the camera operators, the audio operators. Our job is to let them create the best content they possibly can imagine and do. Do you think a TD really cares if his switcher is a big Grass Valley K-frame sitting in a truck, or if it's a bunch of compute in AWS, if it gets the job done and he or she just gets to focus on what they're doing? I think that's going to be also the biggest change on engineering. I think, today we still make big switchers to do big things because we have to do it in FPGA. We have to do it in hardware. That's what technology of today allows. But if you want to do a small to medium-sized production in the cloud, we can also do that today. But we are literally limited by the capabilities of Intel processors and memory and the amount of communication bus between processing nodes. As we all know, that's going to increase exponentially every year. It does. I mean, there might be a law about that by a guy named Moore, might have talked about that like 30 or 40 years ago. Granted, the law is not quite sticking to the way it was originally intended because now we have multiple core processors and blah, blah, blah. But we're still seeing network bandwidth and storage and compute grow exponentially. So in 5 years, a lot of stuff that we have to do in hardware today, we will be able to do in software. So on the engineering side, that's one of the biggest considerations. We have to focus on the user experience. We have to focus on the TD and what control panel do they use, and the audio operator. We have to make sure that the people who are making the content has the tool sets to make that content, and we make everything behind the scenes go away as engineers and just use the process, use the compute that we need to do. That's going to be the biggest change, at least on the engineering side moving forward.
Claire, do you want to take a shot at it?
Absolutely. So I just think the thing I say to all of my clients is just how big is your imagination? What is the most outlandish project that you can think of? In your dreams, what do you want to be achieving? And then we look at the tools to see how we can make it happen, which is what you've already said. But I think it does come down to that translation between technology and creativity, and that can sometimes be so difficult to bridge, and that's half my job, is being able to translate to production companies or producers and directors. They say, I've got this idea, I want to stream from the North Pole, I want to stream from a mountain in Italy. I have no idea whether I can do that. Is it possible? I love that question. Is it possible? And of course it is, because we have unlimited technology available to us, and it's always being innovated and changed and tried and tested. But I think everything is just going to get better. Delay is going to get smaller, and the most outlandish ideas are going to happen, and that is what I just find so exciting.
Excellent.
That's why I'm in business. That's why I'm doing what I do.
Great. Norbert?
Well, one of the themes that Sony was using a couple of years ago was empowering creativity. So I think that sums up the role that we have as manufacturers to enable the creative industry to create better contents faster, more efficient. And especially today, there is content explosion. Everybody wants their own content at their own pace, on their own screen. And where we're going to be in 5 years, still with many contents, many ideas, and brilliant creatives willing to do contents, and technology will just facilitate that. So where cloud, remote, IP, you name it, they will be just part of the way of working. Like for all of us, home office. Mm-hmm. Home office will be part not of an exception, but of a way of working. We're talking about policies that are allowing home office maybe once or twice a month as an exceptional thing a couple of years ago. Who's going to discuss that tomorrow? After the lockdown ends, of course, and we can go back to a normal life, but there will be a mixture. And same with technologies and the way to create content. There will be a mixture because the ways of working and the tool sets will just get on together based on the objective that the creatives will have, because it will be possible. So more creativity with a lot of flexibility on the tool sets, and people will pick and choose. That's why I like this distributed production model in its own concept. Is you pick the resource, whether it's creative brain, the engineering, or the processing back ends that you require, you put them together and you go. And that's where we're going to be in 5 years. There will be a palette. It's like going from BT 709 to BT 2020. The palette of colors, the palette of options will just get wider with more depth, with more possibilities, and all at the disposal of the creative industry. So I'd love to be there in 5 years still. I'm young, so that should be fine. But seeing how the creatives will take on these new tool sets that we as manufacturers are going to look at providing. And yes, there will be more software, more cloud native, more connected, because that's the direction from a technological standpoint. Then the creatives will decide what they do with them in 5 years' time.
Great. Stephen, do you want to take us out?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I like what Claire said. And just before the London Olympic in 2012, James Cameron, explorer and a movie maker and director, and you know what? He wanted to go to the Mariana Trenches, the deepest point on Earth. And guess what? We've connected him live from the Mariana Trenches for the National Geographic. The way I describe it is how big is your imagination? Absolutely right. If you want me to describe 5 years from around remote production, I want to take you 3 years ago. Fox Sports Australia, they host, the right holder for many Australian codes and sports. They came with an idea. They wanted distributed production network, utilizing two centralized hubs 3 years ago. Fox Sports today produce every single sport using remote production for the last 3 years. National Rugby League, Australian soccer, or football, sorry for European, Australian rules. Every single sport today, director sit at two remote production, either in Melbourne or Andrews Hub in Sydney, and everything produced using remote production. So the way I want to describe it in 5 years from now, there will be more artificial intelligence introduced. As Robert said, it's going to be just production, but it is the way we're going to do it. So I see a bright future, and we're going to be completely busy. I'm not retiring yet, Robert, so there's still a few years in me, and hopefully I'll see it in the next 5 years.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Robert, and Norbert, Tim, Claire, and Stephen. Thank you very much for this.